right, it's time for your weekly dose of common sense, or not so common sense, as we like to call it here on Credlin. And who else but Mark Latham to join us now to wade through all of these headlines. And he comes to me from the capital of common sense up there in Newcastle. You've just heard Gideon Rosner there, Mark, this IPA report about the price of going net zero by 2050. You and I have talked about this before. We've looked at stuff that's happening in New South Wales in particular, pushed around by that favourite Green Liberal of some, Matt Keane, not my favourite, let me tell you. Why are governments invested in making up some of these numbers and not prepared to talk and discuss and debate the real cost of these climate targets, do you think?
Well, it's a very good point, Peter, because we're talking about the future of the entire Australian economy and working people having a job and having the capacity to look after their families. So governments have gone down this path, and most recently Scott Morrison are talking about a net zero 2050 as a kind of virtue signal. Oh, aren't I nice? Aren't I admirable that I'm going to try and go to this policy target, without putting out and being honest with the Australian people about the hard economic data that underpins it. And what we've seen from the IPA is a glimpse of what it means. It's a complete and utter economic suicide note for Australian workers. And the IPA research there gives us a pretty good guide to the direction we're headed in, and that is mass loss of employment. In New South Wales, John Barilaro, the Deputy Premier, has said that if you go net zero 2050, it's the end of agriculture, the end of mining. And you can see that in the impact in those regional seats, which featured parks in the centre of New South Wales. So there's no doubt that the modelling behind the scenes has been undertaken, but we're not seeing much of the hard numbers. So good on the IPA for putting out their numbers. 12 months ago, when the New South Wales government, Matt Keane, released their net zero 2050 policy, I asked him what's the modelling underpinning, and he said his department did some of their own work and relied on Commonwealth modelling. Well, there was only one report from the Commonwealth available to them, and that was a CSIRO National Outlook technical report, and that showed two very important things. And this is what this policy is about. It showed to get to net zero 2050, you need the equivalent of a carbon price of $200, which is 8 times what Julia Gillard did with her carbon tax. I know you fought hard against that. You know all about it. And the second piece out of that CSIRO report is that New South Wales would be throwing away $25,000 in household income for every person in the state over the next 30 years. So for a family of 4, it's a net loss of income capacity of $100,000. And on top of that, we're talking about 650,000 jobs being lost nationwide. So the politicians can virtue signal and say, I've got this nice target, I'm a really moral and ethical person, I'm in tune with the climate change issue. But what they're doing is wrecking the Australian economy, and in regions in particular, household income, and also jacking up the price of electricity.
I want to move on to 2 other issues, but I have to underscore the point. When I listened to the NFF out there the other day saying that they were really comfortable with 2050, that they don't want to carve out for agriculture, I think people need to understand that they say the dairy farmer will have to buy, if he runs a dairy herd, because obviously bovine fluctuations and everything else with the cows, the dairy farmer will have to go and purchase carbon offset credits in order to keep this terrible industry going forward. So there'll be different prices now for your milk and your cheese and all of these things. And that there'll be other farmland around Australia turned into carbon sinks. So towns that might have had agriculture in them and productive farming will be completely locked up. We see a lot of this in northern New South Wales and Queensland. And those carbon sinks are in basically a trading scheme that only bankers get rich on. And these towns lose farms, and they lose kids in the school, and they lose all the things that keep our communities vibrant. So when they say that the NFF, the agriculture union's happy about it, on the ground, towns and farmers, I know, I talk to them, my family is in the bush, I grew up in the bush, they are really angry about this, and they don't think that there's a fair income debate about it in this country.
Well, they should be very angry because their whole future is on the line. Even in New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, the darling of the left, exempted agriculture. Why wouldn't we do that here? Right. Why wouldn't we at least exempt the trade exposed industries? And the NFF put up the white flag and surrendered. So too did the union movement. This was a moment in time earlier this week, Peter, for the Australian trade union movement when the head of the ACTU said, we don't see need for any exceptions. It should be net zero 2050 across the board. Well, the fact they didn't even fight for a nanosecond for manufacturing and mining jobs, which is the base of private sector trade unionism in Australia, that in itself is an historic betrayal of working people in this country. Why anyone would pay their union fees and be affiliated to the ACTU when they wouldn't fight for a second for those jobs in mining and manufacturing.
And we've all got the rhetoric from last year in the middle of COVID that we want to be a manufacturing country, that we don't want to be so reliant, particularly on Asian supply chains. And here we are, 6 months on, and we're rolling over. Two quick questions. One, I've got to draw your attention. Christina KENEALLY, she's in a bit of a dogfight in the Senate for the #1 spot on the New South Wales Senate ticket. She's up against Deb O'Neill. Where's this headed? I know she's claiming sort of front bench status to roll Deb O'Neill, but Deb O'Neill's got a lot of support there too. She was up on the Central Coast as a lower house member. She's now in the Senate. Who do you think is going to prevail?
Well, I hope it's Deb O'Neill, who's a lot closer to working people. She's done a lot of good work on the religious freedom issue, which is very, very important in Australia at the moment. But when will Labor learn with Christina KENEALLY? A decade ago, she was the leader of the Labor Party in New South Wales, and she lost 32 seats, got down to a primary vote of 25% with the most ramshackle, incompetent government we've ever seen in this state. And then she had a crack at the Bennelong by-election. Unlike Deb O'Neill, she couldn't win a lower house seat, and then she bobbed up as Bill Shorten's right-hand person in the last federal election campaign, lost the unlosable election. So if Labor hasn't worked out the pattern of Christina KENEALLY being grossly unpopular, and I've got to say that American twang coming through the TV is a massive vote loser for Labor, election after election after election. She's elite. She's out of touch. She lives on a millionaire island in Pittwater. Deb O'Neill at least is in contact with working people and would be a much better representative for the Labor Party. And probably for that reason, Deb O'Neill will miss out because Labor's lost all touch with working people, and KENEALLY is now their prototype, someone who essentially would easily fit into the Greens.
Gee, I hope you and I are saying nice things about Deb O'Neill, or at least saying she's effective, doesn't sign her death warrant. Mark Latham, thanks for coming on the show. See you next week.
Okay, thanks, Peter.